Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And we have a very special returning guest. We're super excited about her today. But before we get to her, also now officially can say our tickets are on sale for this year's Beyond the Grave event. I know we officially put them up for sale this past Tuesday, and I've noticed, I just checked it recently. We have a couple of tours that are already nearly sold out. There's like 2 spots left on a couple of the tours and several others that are only half full. So be sure if you're planning to attend, that one is Evergreen Cemetery in Colorado Springs, October 4th and October 5th. But if you're planning to attend, please make sure you get those tickets sooner rather than later because it's going to sell out again this year.
I don't think we sold tickets. This is our 4th year, and I do not think we sold tickets this many this fast in previous
this early on.
Which goes to say that people really like this event.
Which I'm super excited. And this year, the event is based on Frankenstein. So we are looking forward to, I know it's put me very into a Mary Wollstonecraft exploratory thing lately. I've been listening to a book that details both women's lives, the mother-daughter going back and forth between, and I am the hugest Mary Wollstonecraft fan. I already kind of knew who she was before, but more so, she's like my hero right now on so many levels. I didn't
get around to reading Dracula. I did The Legend of the Sleepy Hollow. I did read that, which was a short story, was a novel, but I did read Frankenstein, and I don't read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's not like the horror, and I usually don't read horror books like this, but oh my goodness, I could not put it down. And to think she was only 18 years old when she wrote this is even more phenomenal. So
yeah, it's great. So we are looking forward to both events. Again, ticket links are in the show notes and on our website. So if you're interested in attending, make sure you get your tickets. And again, for Beyond the Grave, our tickets are only sold online. That one I know for sure. We don't sell them at the gate. This is something, because it's a tour through the cemetery that you're riding through, we have to make sure we sell it out or pre-sell them so that we can plan on where everybody goes on these tours, since it's not a walking tour. So today, we and all our fellow AGSers I know have been excited about this book. I've seen it going up on Facebook and Instagram all the time.
Oh, that's so cool.
But we are super excited to have Joy Giguere back on. She joined us about this time last year to talk a little bit about one of the topics that's in this book, but she just recently published her whole book, Pleasure Grounds of Death, The Rural Cemetery in 19th-century America. Such a good book. It's going to be that reference book that I will pull so many times when we're doing research and planning future episodes. Here's the book here, my copy of it. So Joy, welcome back.
Yes, welcome.
And I am so excited to be back. Thank you for having me.
And this book is phenomenal. We were just saying the amount of research that you've done. And of course, you mentioned it yourself before we started recording. It's taken you years to get to a point where you could actually put all the information that you've been gathering into this format and make it make sense and, have a nice timeline. I can't even imagine how you've done some of it because you have such detail on certain topics within the book that come up here and there when we're talking about certain types of cemeteries or certain time periods or whatever. But the fact that you were able to put all of this together, and it really makes the whole cemetery outside of a traditional burial ground make way more sense for a lot of different parts of our country, but even cemeteries in other countries, because you talked about Paris and London and some other stuff in here too. And so the whole rural cemetery movement and how that transformed is just so well done in this book. And like I said, this will be one I pull. Plus, I had to, and I mentioned it earlier, I love the cover, absolutely adore the cover of this book. This is one that you want to frame almost and hang on the wall because it's just such a gorgeous depiction. It's Laurel Hill Cemetery, which is a gorgeous cemetery anyway. I mean, I've never been there in person yet, but I've seen lots of pictures, but it just turned out so gorgeous. So congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. And gosh, your kind words, you're going to make me blush here.
Well, I want to give a glowing review because I have absolutely loved this book. And like I said, I can't wait to use it for future reference, because you do detail so many interesting things. So when we had you on last, you really focused on the conversation we talked about was how the idea of the rural cemetery went from being a rural cemetery to the lawn cemetery. And that was pretty much our whole conversation the last time you were on. And I'll link that episode in the show notes in case anybody wants to listen to that. But this really, the whole rest of the book starts with, going into how we even had to get away from having these traditional burial grounds that were on the sites of churches and town
Commons.
Small,
town commons and stuff, to having these cemeteries that were a little further outside, and then how they became such like a cultural icon across the nation, and how that kind of spread. And I loved reading the details of how it would change from place to place. Everybody had a different thought about what they wanted in their cemetery or what they thought their cemetery should be, and then who could be buried in these cemeteries and how do you separate them out, and then of course how over the course beginning from we'll say the early 1800s, because with all the different wars that we fought even on our own soil, how that changed how these cemeteries and spaces were used and memorialized and things like that. So this is an excellent book for anybody who wants to really know like how the cemetery movement really became what it is and how we revere cemeteries like we do now. This is a great book to learn all of that information.
I think because I originally got it on Kindle so I could read it online, or not Kindle, but the PDF, and I was reading it. And within just a short amount of time, I asked Jenny, please get me a hard copy, because I'm dog-earing and tabbing, because it is a reference book. You go into depth, so much depth. It's not just a Passover, statement that you make. You go into depth, you go wide. But like Jenny said about the history of cemeteries, it's our country's history. It's in here. So it really is absolutely fabulous. And I know the thing that I got the biggest kick out of is how things have not changed. You have to tell people how to behave in cemeteries.
Oh yes.
That cracked me up. But okay.
I appreciate your thoughts on this being a usable reference book, but also one of my major priorities in writing, and what has become a major priority in my general writing style through the years is to write things that are readable.
Yes.
That this is not just for a handful of fellow scholars to read. And this is why in the opening page, the dedication is to my mother, Pat Giguere. She has proofread everything I've written since grade school, including all the chapters of this book. And my mother is what I would consider an intelligent lay reader. She's, not a scholar, not an academic,
right?
Didn't go to college, but she's an intelligent reader, and she can read my stuff and say, yeah, I understand it, I get it, and it's interesting. And if I do, for whatever reason, fall into using some jargon or something like that, she might make a little comment about something in the margins, but that seldom ever happens, because I always think
Professor Joy talking.
Well, I always think to myself, well, if mom can read this, everybody can read it. And I want it to be, for students and researchers and scholars, but also just for people who are interested in cemeteries and who want a good story about cemeteries, because I was trying to approach this as, what is the story of the rural cemetery in the United States? Not a clinical dissection and an examination of these landscapes, but how do I tell the story of these landscapes and why they're important, and why they evolved the way that they did in our country.
And that's something your book does very well. It is not, like you said, it is a great reference, but it's not like a dry reference book where you're just looking up terms and information and stuff. You wrote a story that's easy to follow, and it goes through a whole timeline of, especially for America, since you did talk about some other countries and what was going on there and how that influenced what we were doing in America. But it really does start with our very simple burial grounds, when communities were smaller and there weren't so many people, but then communities grew and as things urbanized, things changed, and we still have to have a place to bury people. And you go through the whole story of like disease and how that played a huge part in why the rural cemetery movement even began in certain cases. All these epidemics that were happening in different parts of the country at different times. And so it's easy to follow. And I love the amount of, because you did a lot of digging in like old newspapers and things like that. So I love that you quote a lot of that.
Yeah.
Just because I love reading old newspaper articles and stuff. The way they wrote the news back then was just so entertaining sometimes. And you also have a lot of comparisons from people who traveled a lot and saw different things and said, some of the comments that people wrote about certain cemeteries were hilarious. Like I did laugh out loud a couple of times at some of the comments that people made, because I'm like, okay, well, I'm sure that's a true observation. It's just kind of funny the way you wrote about it and how this went out to, some public thing, either in a newspaper or a pamphlet or whatever, whoever was doing the writing. And I loved that you shared all of that in there.
So I love doing newspaper research. I find that you can get your finger on the pulse of historical public sentiment on so many different things. And one of my favorite resources, I have a monthly subscription to it because our university databases doesn't have it for whatever reason, is newspapers.com. And we have like dozens of other newspaper databases that I have access to through the university, but I maintain a private subscription to newspapers.com because that has proven to be immeasurably useful to me. And I'll do like keyword searches for rural cemetery and see, okay, what pops up? And you can delimit, locations and time periods and things like that. And you really do, you get a sense for, how did the locals feel about this stuff? And they published things like the dedication day or consecration addresses, and how many people showed up, and what was the weather like, and what were the ladies wearing, and boasting that, this is going to be the most beautiful and the most popular cemetery in all of the country in years to come. They really get into this whole idea of like, this is going to be a place of local pride and national significance. And you could see like those local media like crowing about how awesome their cemetery is. And I just love
really
that.
Did. And they were like determined, especially as we get a little later into the Victorian era, they wanted these to be like tourist destinations. They were like, come to our town and come to our cemetery specifically, which I know people, for those people that aren't quite as into cemeteries as the rest of us, always think, why are you going to cemeteries when you go on vacation? And I have to laugh because I do go to cemeteries on vacation, specifically because I find them fascinating. And there's a lot of us that still do that. I think it's picked up momentum again in the last few years where people realize that that's something we can do and that you learn a lot of things and can see a lot in a cemetery. But I love how in here, when they really started to build out these cemeteries and they were creating all these landscapes that people could travel through. And, then you have all the various stone carvers creating masterpieces of work. They're like, you need to come see all of this. And it became a popular tourist destination. Like, I just think that's so fascinating that that's how they were touting. They're like, this isn't just where we're going to bury our dead. This is, you have to come here and see this. Like, this is a whole place to spend your afternoon.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can see not only like the development of the landscapes, but the evolution of American sculptural art, of these developments in stone quarrying and cutting technologies, and how you have American sculptors trained in Europe, but now they're executing their skills here in the United States so that more families, they can purchase a three-dimensional cemetery monument that's been manufactured locally rather than having to import from Italy. And that's like a really big deal. And I'm also you mentioned all the tourists. I was struck by how many people traveled and then published their travel diaries. And it wasn't like they wrote their travel diaries and then a century later someone published them, but you look at the publication dates and like they're traveling in the 1820s, and then they're like, I don't know what they were doing. They got home and then they reached out to a press and they published their travel diaries. But the public, like, they loved these kinds of things because it gave them insight for those who didn't have the means to travel abroad. It gave them these entertaining insights into other countries, other cities. And you've got these contemporary commentators talking about, Europeans saying, you go to the United States, you need to take the grand tour of the United States. And these are the important things that you have to see. And if you go on the grand tour of the US and you don't go to Mount Auburn and you don't go to Laurel Hill, then you haven't seen the United States.
Which I
Yeah,
love.
and yeah, exactly.
Even Europeans who look down on us, they're like, you have to see these cemeteries. They're amazing. They're so surprised.
And except for those cemeteries, it's like our cemeteries are, in some cases, sort of forgotten. They're not the, what is it? The shiny object that they were, come see our cemetery, and they were so proud of their cemetery, except for Greenwood, not just Greenwood and Laurel Hill, but those very first rural cemeteries. The people with those cemeteries do value what they have, but there's so many other cemeteries that just have become, they're the cemetery. Who wants to go to the cemetery? They're not, people don't look at them as they did it's almost 200 years ago now, isn't it? So yeah, it's sort of sad that we have lost that love of cemeteries. I mean, at one time it was where everybody went because there was no parks, there was no this. They had to have, ladies had to be escorted by a gentleman, and not a gentleman who would consider himself, I can't think of the word now, a dandy, and it was like,
an exquisite or a walking stick.
Yes.
And it was like, oh my God, it was just so cool. But I think we have lost that reverence for cemeteries. Maybe not back east, but I think we have out here. Out west.
But at the same time, it seems like, I feel like we're kind of going through a renaissance in people going to cemeteries to do various activities. And part of that, I think, comes from the cemeteries themselves trying to market themselves as these public spaces to encourage public activities, and not just walking around, but also holding events where they can raise money. So like 5K races. I know that Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, where we went to for the AGS conference in June, they've got a Run Like Hell 5K in October. I love the title of that.
I love that one too.
Laurel Hill in Philadelphia, they do, I think it's something like Market of the Macabre, something along those lines, where they have vendors that show up and sell things. Some cemeteries, they have movie nights where they set up screens and they sell tickets and they show horror films. And it's a good way for these historic cemeteries to market themselves to the general public and get people to come into the gates, but also to spend some money that helps with maintaining these landscapes, because some of the ones, they have decent endowments, they have protections, they're on the National Historic Registry of Historic Landmarks. Others, they have been pretty well abandoned.
Yeah.
I don't know, did you see recently, within the last couple of weeks, Zillow posted that Philadelphia's Mount Vernon Cemetery is for sale for the low price of, I want to say it was like $6 million. And this is practically across the street from Laurel Hill Cemetery. This was another cemetery established during the rural cemetery movement. I think this one dated, might see my memory is already becoming fuzzy. I want to say it was in the 1850s. Mount Vernon was established, but it was established as a rural cemetery, as basically like an alternative to Laurel Hill. And there's some significant families buried there, like the Barrymore family, the actors. They're buried at Mount Vernon. But you look at aerial photographs of Mount Vernon and it's all green, like the monuments have been swallowed up and eaten by greenery and climbing vines and things like that. And we had a Pennsylvania chapter meeting a couple of years ago where one of the members of the Friends group at Mount Auburn presented, talking about their efforts to try and rehabilitate it, clean things up. And it was, he said, we'd spend weeks just on one plot trying to clear away the greenery and reveal the monuments. And it would take forever just to do like one very small space. And it had also become very dangerous because they would be clearing stuff away and then like a grave shaft would collapse.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's scary.
So I'm not entirely sure what precipitated this real estate listing. To own a historic piece of Philadelphia history, you can buy Mount Vernon, and I was really shocked when I saw that.
Some of our big rich investors out there should invest in it because they can afford the investment to fix it back up. I'm just going to say, instead of some of the other investments they make.
But where Mount Vernon has been swallowed up by greenery, you have other historic rural cemeteries that have just been bulldozed into
Yep.
oblivion. So not all of them have survived and maintained their cherished status as local cultural landmarks. Others, they have managed to hold on, and you've got some places like Mount Auburn, it's still an active cemetery. They're still selling plots.
Mhm.
They cost an arm and a leg. Same thing at Greenwood, but they have continued to evolve and develop their landscapes to meet modern interests and needs and aesthetics. You could see how, as they've added land over the years, you've got the original core cemetery, but then you've got later ones that are designed on the landscape lawn model. Then you've got like the memorial park sections. And what's interesting at Mount Auburn is now that green burials have become increasingly popular. So essentially what was old is new.
Yeah.
Or
Right.
It's
It's
new.
all come back around.
What was old is new again. The 19th century style burial. If you want to have a green burial at Mount Auburn, that's in the old historic section of the cemetery. That's where you
Oh.
have green burials.
Well, that's pretty neat. They don't have their own stuff.
So yeah, they've continued to keep working with what the public is interested in and market themselves appropriately so that they retain this salience within modern society, not just as historic landmark landscapes and places for people to go bird watching and look at flowers and see historic monuments, but they're still active burial grounds. And some of these cemeteries, they have been so adept and so effective at doing this, and it's really wonderful to see that. But when you see the contrast of those that have
Right.
fallen into disrepair or have literally disappeared off the map, that makes it even more tragic for those.
Well, and I think some of that comes down to education a little bit too, in some degrees. Um, there's a lot of people, and we've talked about this in other episodes, that don't understand how cemeteries most of the time are cared for. So a lot of cemeteries offer a perpetual care fund, but those perpetual care funds are very limited as to what the care actually entails. And if for some reason, and there's been plenty of cemeteries that have run out of those funds or things got changed over or whatever, and then of course you lose that significance of that cemetery. And depending on how community grows too, different communities grow over time. There's a lot, especially in bigger cities, you have a lot of areas where one immigration population moved in for a while. They were able to build up some wealth and they got their education and they had a few generations who were born here. So they moved out of that area. But then you have a different group come into that same space. And I'm thinking Denver specifically has some areas in our city where we'd have one population come in for 2 or 3 generations and they'd move on. And then we'd have a new immigrant population come in. So some of their burial sites got forgotten as they moved on, as a population moved on, and then they were rediscovered or just completely forgotten, like you said, bulldozed over and completely forgotten or built over. And then when somebody else does construction one day, they find a grave and they're like, wait, what's going on here? Surprise. Yes, there was a cemetery here at one point. But I do think some of that comes down to education. I think there's a lot of people in the general public that just think that if you have a cemetery, it just gets taken care of. Like somebody's going to take care of it.
Well, especially if it's a city-owned cemetery. Why isn't the city doing this? Why aren't they fixing this? Why aren't they fixing that?
And cities only have so much money that they can throw at cemeteries too, which is why there's endowments and fundraisers and all of the other things that have to happen to keep these really truly historic cemeteries going.
Well, it depends how that cemetery within the city is classified. Say, for instance, if it's an enterprise and they are pretty much self-sufficient, which it is impossible to care for a cemetery if they are only raising their own funds, if there's no other money coming in, say, from taxpayers or that. And
you can't just go ask the city for money. That doesn't work.
No, it does not.
But like I said, some of these cemeteries, they have very deftly figured out how to raise funds. They have very effective friends groups. When AGS was in Atlanta in June and we went to Oakland, we were so excited because they have this fabulous gift shop bookstore. And And we were told that they initially were planning on not opening up the gift shop that day. And our conference host told them right out, look, you need to open today.
You're like,
You're gonna
people are going
make
to spend money
so
here.
much money.
Yeah, that was like, oh my gosh.
I love it.
So excited. And yes, they had a big day in their bookshop the
I
day that
bet they did. Yeah, I think I'd be very disappointed if I went to one of the, because there are a couple of cemeteries around the country that have gift shops now connected to them. And I'd be so disappointed if I went and couldn't go buy the books and other stuff.
Especially like,
Well,
yeah, in the
I already
cemetery
knew that it
district.
was there. I already knew that it was there. And I had been in Atlanta in fall 22 when I was on sabbatical. And my husband and I, we went to Oakland. My sister-in-law lives in Atlanta. So we had the kids at her house with their cousins. And we decided, okay, we're gonna go to Oakland for the afternoon. We got there like literally 5 minutes after they closed the shop. And I was like, oh.
Ah. You're like, man, I know it would.
I was looking in the door through the glass, like
Oh,
seeing all this stuff, and there I was like, oh man.
Oh, so one of the things that I loved about your book is the amount of cooperation you got from certain cemeteries when you were putting all of it, like the amount of information they shared with you, artwork in this case. Laurel Hill was the one nice enough to pull the artwork for you for the cover. You really built up some really good connections with the historians locally, the cemeteries, all of that to get so much of this information. And again, I love that it's all in one place now. Like
yeah.
you don't have to dig through several other books or websites or whatever to come up with the information you came up with. How did you go about developing those connections? And I mean, you do have professor status as a, that you probably helps, but how else were you able to do that in order to compile the information in the way that you were able to compile it?
Yeah, I think for one, having a .edu email address certainly helps because they know, okay, like it's not just some like,
It's a
kook off
legitimate,
the street.
yeah.
Um, but I tell you what, these are relationships I've been building for years. So like the folks at Mount Auburn, I've known since I was in grad school when I was working on the Egyptian revival stuff and I started researching the Sphinx at Mount Auburn. I took trips because I was still living in Maine. So it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that big of a haul for me to get down to Cambridge. So I took physical trips to the archive. They have their archives on site.
Oh,
And so I did archival
amazing.
research there and got to meet, the people on the ground. And so I've had those relationships like with Meg Winslow there basically for, oh gosh, close to 20 years now
I love it.
where they just, they know me. And so if I email Meg, she's like, hey, um, and, and it was, when I first started at Penn State back in 2014, one of my first research trips was out to Louisville, Kentucky and Frankfort, Kentucky. And I had a research fellowship with the Kentucky Historical Society. So I spent part of a week at the KHS doing research there. And then I popped over to Louisville to go to the Filson Historical
Mm,
Society and Cave Hill Cemetery. So, going to these places, I was able to meet these people so that we could, introduce ourselves face to face. And so they knew who I was and what I was researching, and they understood like what I was trying to accomplish with certain projects. And all of this preceded me working on pleasure grounds. Um, for a lot of the Pennsylvania people, so like the folks at Laurel Hill, the folks at Homewood and Pittsburgh, that came from finished once I completed getting tenure at Penn State in 2020, then it was like I was unleashed to really go back to doing more AGS things. Because when I was hired, I was given a very gentle, well, Joy, you've done a lot of stuff with this AGS organization, but we need you to diversify for the next 6 years. So maybe reel it in a bit. And so I didn't go to AGS conferences for 6 years.
Oh,
I moved to Pennsylvania wanting to start a Pennsylvania chapter. And I felt like I had, it wasn't a mean muzzle, but like a gentle muzzle. Like I can't really do this until this whole process is over.
right.
So it wasn't until after 2020. And of course, we were in the midst of COVID. that I finally got all my ducks in a row, and I got our markers editor, Beth Roark, and then another AGS member, Cami Fletcher. The three of us formed the Pennsylvania chapter. And we started having regular fall and spring meetings. And I've tried to do Pennsylvania on the same model that I did the Indiana chapter when I was living there for 5 years, that we try and bounce around the state and have meetings
I
at
love
different
it.
cemeteries and institutions. And so we had one of our early meetings at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in
Mm.
Philly. We've had a meeting at Allegheny Cemetery. We had our spring 24 meeting we had at Gettysburg. So it's great running the Pennsylvania chapter. It's gotten me into contact with a lot of the Pennsylvania cemetery people that I might otherwise have only known through email connections.
Right.
So when I emailed Laurel Hill and said, "Hey guys, you've got the color copy of the lithograph that I want for the cover," they're like, "Okay, let's make it happen." Because they
That's
knew
so cool.
they knew what the project was. They were excited for it. They knew that Laurel Hill featured. I was on phone calls with their archives people like, "Look, I cannot seem to find anything that tells me when Laurel Hill desegregated." And they're like, "Okay, we'll call you back in an hour." And they did.
I love it. They were probably going, oh, wait, we never thought about that. Let's go figure that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
Like,
had to look it up. But they had the records. So it was things that I couldn't just easily find online. I couldn't search on their database on the
mhm.
cemetery website. So I'd be like, "All right, I'm going to make a phone call." And I think it's just like you do this research and there's only so much that you can get online. There's only
Yep.
so much that's been digitized that
Hmm.
you can in the databases, that you can search in the newspaper. Sometimes you actually have to pick up the phone or send an email to a specific person and be like, "Look, even if you haven't met face to face, say, this is who I am. This is the project that I'm working on."
Mhm.
And because of the nature of the project, every person I ever wrote to or talked to at any of the cemeteries that I contacted, they were down to help me because they're like, "This project sounds great." And of course, it gives more notice to the public about what these institutions are and why they're
Right.
significant. So people were incredibly helpful, and it's been nice to be able to say, "Okay, I've got this increasingly vast network of cemetery professionals that are excited about this book project and that have been waiting for it to come out."
Like I said, I could tell when it did finally come out, all the AGSers on social media were just like, look, here's my copy, and this is what I'm doing tonight. I'm reading this
I
book. And
loved
I loved
seeing that.
seeing all of those posts. And I made the same post. Once my copy came, I was like, and here's what I'm doing tonight. I'm reading this book. Like, I had my cup of tea, I had the book, I was good to go. This is like, and again, I love it because it is a book that you can just sit and read, makes
Right.
complete sense. It's not dry. It's not just the dates and places and people that were involved. It's the story of these cemeteries. In essence, it's the story of our country, though, because it
Exactly.
goes back I mean, you have to go back pretty much to the beginning,
Mhm.
where you start in, these small New England towns where they had their simple little burial grounds that the cows
Mhm.
were trampling over. And, I loved your description at one point. You had mentioned, like, they would come into town like on Sundays and they'd be out just leaning up against the stones, having their conversations between church services and whatever. And then you see the cows come along, and it's like, the funny thing that gets me is, and I will see this in social media groups, how people will get so offended by certain activities that will happen in cemeteries now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, have you ever read about what happened in cemeteries before we decided they were more reverent places
Yeah,
than
there
what
is
they
nothing
are?
new under the sun. Absolutely nothing new. I think that passage you're referring to is when I was talking about the original public burying ground in New Haven, Connecticut,
Mm-hmm.
before they established what for decades they called the new burying ground.
Right.
I always find that endlessly hilarious, the fact that it took them, even though they established the cemetery in 1796, it took them until 1845 to rename it Grove Street Cemetery. And for that whole stretch of time, they called it the new burying.
Well, it distinguished it from the old one that,
Exactly,
kind of
exactly.
went.
And I felt there was this wonderful sense of freedom working on this project because I felt like I was finally at a place as a researcher and a scholar where I felt like I genuinely knew what I was doing. And anyone who's gone through grad school will understand that statement. I think there's so much imposter syndrome in every discipline, but historians, I think all of us are like, am I just making this up? Or, do I really know what I'm talking about? And I think this is why at historical conferences, things can get so heated because people have such different opinions about how and why
Right.
things happened and why certain things are more important than others, or how do we prioritize certain historical topics and stuff like that. But I felt like I had finally accumulated enough general knowledge about cemeteries and 19th century cemeteries in particular that I could really approach it and really talk about it the way I wanted to.
Hmm.
Mm.
That I didn't have anybody on the outside being like, well, you really should be approaching it from this angle. That that I had no outside interference. I didn't have like advisors or professors being,
Right.
questioning the logic behind this. And there were certain things that I remember back when I was in grad school and an early PhD, I'd be saying some of the things that ended up in the book, and I'd have these other people being like, no, that's not right. I I remember fairly early on after I finished my PhD, I had a conversation with Blanche Linden. And anyone who knows scholarship on rural cemeteries, she wrote Silent City on a Hill,
Hmm.
which is the masterwork on Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge,
Hmm.
Massachusetts. It is a classic in the field. It was the first really major book about rural cemeteries, even pointing out their significance at all. And it was very, very much focused on Mount Auburn. And I remember having this discussion with her where I was saying, I really think that epidemic disease had a major part to play in all of this. And she's like, it's not as big a deal. It's not as big a part as you seem to think. And I was like, are you sure? And but she was the senior scholar and she's like, oh yeah, I'm absolutely sure. No, epidemic disease was nowhere near as big a deal as you seem to think it is. And then I finally started working on this. And I was like, I can't just jump into Mount Auburn. I got to lead up to this.
Right.
Look at the precursors to this. So this is why, chapter 1 starts with New Haven and what's happening in New Haven. And like the whole impetus, even before we get to the rural cemetery movement, even before we get to Mount Auburn, we've got these communities that are dealing with major outbreaks of yellow fever and scarlet fever and diphtheria, and they're burying, sometimes 5 or 10% of the local population in a
Yeah.
year. And that's causing such massive strains on these old public burying grounds that date back to the 17th century. And I remember like looking at this and looking at all of the documentation, the newspaper articles and the medical journal articles from the time period where you have these physicians that are hemming and hawing about the source of yellow fever, what's the cause, the impact that it's having on these communities. You have locals writing about how we've got a serious burial problem here because we got so many sick people that are dying.
Right.
At it going, no, I was right the first time.
Mhm.
You're like, I'm pretty sure this had a significant part in why we had to move our cemeteries.
So unfortunately, Blanche passed away about 10 years ago, so I couldn't do an I told you so with her. But um,
She knows.
hopefully she's not too cranky about it from the other side. But I will say, it was gratifying to feel that sense of being able to really dive very deeply into these materials and things that I had had hunches about for years, that I had kind of said, well, I think this was what it was, to actually see in print, not just like a random article,
Right.
but like multiple publications from these time periods saying the same thing over and over and over again. I'm like, okay, yeah, I had the right idea and I'm
Mhm.
gonna run with it because I knew what I wanted to be able to say about it, but like, I had these people around me be like, nah, that can't be it. And I think part of it though is that so many of the studies that came before were very focused on a cemetery or the rural cemetery movement, just as the rural cemetery movement.
Right.
And you look at some studies and they've got pretty hard cutoffs. Like it starts with Mount Auburn in 1831, and by 1865, the rural cemetery movement is done. It is dead, and landscape lawn is taking over. And as I point out in the book, that's really not the case.
Right.
We need a more extended temporal range
Mm-hmm.
the rural cemetery movement, because again, a lot of these studies, they're east of the Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look west of the Mississippi, you've got all of these former frontier towns and communities that are building up more in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. They're trying to exit frontier status. They're trying to seem more civilized, more polished, more put together. They're trying to establish a reputation so that, hey, Easterners, come out here, and you won't feel like you're in the backwoods or something like that.
Right.
And they are very self-consciously designing new cemeteries, and they're calling them rural cemeteries in the years beyond what other scholars had traditionally defined as part of the rural cemetery movement.
Right.
So we think, it's getting back to my initial point here, if I had one, was that, I had this sense like I want to tell like this grand story. And I had all of these ideas that had been ruminating in my head for about rural cemeteries that like every other scholar was like, no. And then when I finally started like seriously sitting down and looking at the materials and looking at the primary source documents and the newspaper articles and the cemetery trustee documents and letters and things like that, and I'm like, oh my God, I was right the whole time. And that
See, yeah.
most wonderful thing as a historian, to be like, I had this idea and turns out I was right. And it's not, manipulating the documents to prove a point, but it was like, I think this is what it was. And I'm finding mountains of materials that are supporting that. And that's the most exciting thing in the world.
Oh yeah.
So
Well, and you
this was
found
your
it.
message. This was your message to share. You had a different perspective. You looked at it differently. And that's why you knew deep down inside you were right about the diseases. And even though other people said, no, 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 you still knew. And then it just took you a little bit of time to see it.
Well, and I don't think before this book, like you said, some of the other more primary sources that we think of, nobody had looked into some of the sources that you were using, like those newspaper
Right.
articles, like the travel journals of
Primary
the tourists that came to
Mhm.
and from and talked about what they were seeing in the towns and experiencing from their first person account. Like that's their first person account that you were reading. And you could see that, oh yeah, this is why they decided, in New York, they were going to do this. Whereas in Louisiana, they decided they were doing this. But the other thing I really like about your book is it kind of gives us an idea of how, in America at least, our ideas around death and burial have changed from, and you talk about it, it used to be the families prepared the bodies, the families went to, they would hire, there was usually a sexton or somebody that dug the graves, but they prepared the bodies, they went to the services, they did everything themselves. And over time, especially after the rural cemetery movement and going into those garden cemeteries, that's where we start to see actual people, other people that are starting to prepare the bodies, not the families, where it becomes this whole business. Death becomes more of a business than it had been before. Before it was part of the circle of life, if we want to, reference the Lion King, where, we expect, and because life expectancies were shorter and whatever, and like you said, when you were in a town where there was an epidemic and stuff, people just did it and they kind of moved on with their living because they had to do that to get through it. We see the change in attitudes towards death. And then again, you see it when you talk about pre and post Civil War burials and the cemeteries and how they changed, especially after the Civil War,
Right.
both in the North and the South. And what we were doing to commemorate the soldiers who had died and all these people that lost their lives. And then things became grander and all these monuments went up that weren't grave sites. They were monuments to like whole regiments sometimes, or just one person, like the general or whatever. But it changed our ideas again on the ideas of how we view death and burial and what we do beyond that. And I think that, and that's what influences each generation, right? The next generation after, about their ideas on death and what we do. And you can see that change in the way that you put this story together, because it really does go from this was a family thing that you took care of within your family when somebody died, to, especially if you had money, you could hire these funeral homes and these big trains, and you'd have the whole like procession, these huge funeral processions coming through the cemetery with the carriages. And it became kind of especially in the Victorian era, this rite of, not passage, that's the wrong term, but like if you were wealthy and well respected or whatever, it was talked about in the paper how many carriages were attending your funerals and how many horses there were. And like you said, how the women were all dressed and, who was mourning, whatever. And it wasn't like that in the beginning. And you see those changes. And then you see it again after the Civil War and going into the more modern age of how we conduct our funerals and our services for the dead. And I love that in addition to the cemeteries themselves, we get to see that transition of how, especially as Americans, we think about death and burial and that whole side of it that a lot of people are just uncomfortable thinking about, but it's really an important part of who we are culturally. And then you also delve into like some of the different religions and how they handled things and their sections of the cemeteries or their whole cemeteries right across the street. You talked about some of the Jewish cemeteries that were built adjacent to some of these rural cemeteries and mimicked what they were doing, but they could still do their Jewish traditions within their space. And then of course the segregation of the cemeteries, which to, I think, a lot of modern minds doesn't hit. Like now, if you're in a modern cemetery, you go and buy your plot wherever, right? They're not going to be segregated anymore, but there's a lot of segregation in the North and the South, folks. In all the cemeteries, you're going to find segregated sections for different, and not just for like, African Americans, but you're going to find it for other cultures, other traditions, all of that within those cemeteries and how they did. And that's just what the thought was at the time. And then as again, we got smarter about humans over time, we started to say, okay, we don't need to do this anymore. But it's interesting that you were able to find a lot of those dates and talk about how it affected each of these areas of the country when they started to do that, and how some of the cemeteries altogether were never segregated. There were some of those too. So it's a good look into how life was being lived in different parts of our country, even at the same time and sometimes over time, depending on which cemetery you were talking about.
Yeah.
And I like the fact,
sorry, Diane.
No, because I like the fact that it wasn't just, sometimes when you get a book on a cemetery, you're just focusing on that one book, or I'm sorry, that one cemetery, where yours goes into the web of these cemeteries and how this influenced this cemetery. And then that influenced this cemetery, which could come back around to influence that cemetery. It was like just a constant flow of change. And then of course, as we moved west, things, influences went with, everybody wanted to be the fancy kid on the block, so to speak.
Yeah.
Hey folks, we are going to actually end our conversation with Joy for today and continue it next week. Just a reminder, her book is Pleasure Grounds of Death, The Rural Cemetery in 19th-century America. You can order it through Amazon or several other platforms, and if you go to our show notes, you will find links for the book. Please check it out and then join us next week as we can continue our conversation with Joy about the changes in the rural cemetery.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Dianne and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.